Greetings and salutations, this is Imperator Vespasian and his trusty sidekick.
Hello.
Before you we have a squad of Soviet infantry, and there's several types of Soviet infantry in the army list, and I'm going to go through two main types, which is the regular infantry that you can get, which can be normal or regular, whatever, and then you've got the second echelon troops, who I'll go into a bit more detail about in a minute. Every Soviet army gets itself a extra free squad of inexperienced infantry, and these are basically your second echelon troops. Yeah, I'll go into that. That'll be quite an interesting one. I'm going to go for the infantry first. The Soviet infantry are just the same as any other infantry. They carry a light machine gun, couple of submachine guns, rifles, and have an NCO. They can carry anti-tank grenades just like anybody else. A regular infantry unit will put you back 158 points, which isn't too bad. It's slightly more expensive than your British and American soldiers, mainly because there's an extra figure. Because Soviet infantry units had 11-man teams. That's just how they worked out. They're pretty much box standard. They're pretty much the same as any other army. A good thing about the taking morale tests when you're using Russians is when you take a morale test as infantry, not tanks, don't count for tanks, you get the Great Patriotic War Rule, which is not one step back type thing. If you take a morale test that would destroy the infantry unit, you get to re-roll it once. The Polish have the same rule for their army. So really there's a little bit of patriotism, maybe a bit of desperation in the Russian army's ranks, and certainly at the beginning of the war an idea that they couldn't lose, because they were pretty much winning right up to the point where Germany invaded them. And they were lied to. They were told they were winning all the time, which didn't take long to disillusion, but, you know, it did happen. Yeah, so it's useful having that special rule, because it means the first time you take a test that could break the unit could technically be saved automatically. You could also give the unit a commissar, which means the commissar would execute one of the men, and you can have another test at regaining your morale. Can work, might not work, but it is useful to remember when you're playing games. Now your second echelon infantry. These are the free troops you get. And they're described as prisoners let out of prison and given a uniform and marched off. Now I'll just mention an interesting point. In the box set you get figures like this guy here, and if you notice, he's got the sort of padded clothing. It's a sort of padded thing. The uniform's got like lines in it. That is actually prison uniform. That isn't Soviet army uniform, that's prison uniform. They were used because the Russians didn't have the uniforms to put the men in. So they just used anything they got, and they happened to have large amounts of places making prison issue uniforms, and they just
what a surprise! So
they gave those regular soldiers with prison uniforms to wear, but some of them will actually be wearing their actual prison uniform. So that's an interesting thing to note. And you tend to find photographs of Russians. If you look through online, you can find photographs of Russians, particularly the Russians surrendering to the Germans, and they will be wearing that quilted pattern uniform in summer. And those guys are most likely second echelon troops. Now these Untrained, generally untrained. But when you think of second echelon troops as being criminals, they're criminals. They've committed thought crime mostly, but most of them were not criminals. The Soviet Union executed real criminals, so there weren't any real criminals in prison. The people in prison were people the party didn't like. They were political prisoners. They were people who had spoken out of turn. The prisons were full of these people. And
people said, I don't think you should do that.
Yeah. Also, for the Soviet army, which is why the not one step back rule is handy, the Great Patriotic War thing, the reason the Russian army can take an extra morale test is because Soviet soldiers knew that if they surrendered to the Germans, their families would be put in prison and starved to death.
So if you didn't surrender, but you died...
If you died, you're alright.
But how did they know
But
that
if you
died?
surrendered,
Surrendered?
because the Germans told people who's been taken prisoner.
Oh, wow. Okay.
And if you surrender, then your family will be rounded up and put in a camp. And if you're lucky, they'll be put in a camp. If not, they'll be shot. And if they're put in a camp, they'll probably die. So a lot of these guys would have also have had their father or brother surrender to the Germans. And so they were sent out to fight the Germans as sort of a punishment. So you did get a tendency of these guys to want to surrender and to want to change sides and fight for the Germans, which did happen. Sorry if it upsets you, but that's life, deal with it. And so when you're thinking of the infantry, they're not necessarily raw green infantry. They're not criminals either. Most of them are forced to fight, and they usually have the officer is technically a commissar. So there is a bit of that as well, and so you know what commissars are, and so yeah, you have the special rule which enables you to re-roll. It does not necessarily mean the reason your Soviet troops are re-rolling is because they're heroic soldiers fighting against evil Nazism. It means that they're re-rolling because they will only face a firing squad from their own, and their families will end up in prison. When the defenders of Brest, the Russian fortress on the German border, fought valiantly against the Germans, it held the Germans up so long that even Hitler himself said that the men deserve a commendation because they fought so well. Stalin had all of them shot at the end of the war, the entire garrison. Who surrendered? Yeah, they surrendered. They only surrendered because they ran out of ammunition. They fought to the last bullet, and they held out for weeks against the Germans. And in the end, they ran out of bullets, so they had to surrender.
Stalin wasn't a kind man, was he?
Yeah, he wasn't a kind man. And at the end of the war, all those men returned home to Russia, and they were all taken off the train and machine gunned into a ditch. And all their families.
And they thought they were going to make it.
Yeah, and all their families had already been starved to death in work camps. So, yeah, that's the regime you're fighting for. That's the regime.
Weren't there more Russians fighting on for the Germans when they were invading Russia than there were Russians fighting?
There were a lot of dissident Russians who were in the German army.
So there was two sides of the motherland.
Oh, it was more civil war than anything else, yeah. Certainly in places like Ukraine, where massive amounts of people joined the German army, and fell out with the Germans pretty quickly because the Germans weren't that nice.
No, they both weren't that nice. Let's be honest right now.
The Germans would come through the town and people would throw flowers at them. I mean, genuinely happy to see the Germans because they thought the Germans were liberating them. And then the Germans would kick the door in and steal the sheep. And you were like, hang on a minute, that's for liberating us. Yes, but we need food. Give us all your food now. What am I going to eat? You starve. No, thank you very much. And then the Germans would go through the town and say, is anyone a member of the Communist Party? And then there'd be a raffle to decide who was going to be chosen to be members of the Communist Party that day, and they would all be taken into a field and shot.
For being communists.
For being communists.
Supposed to be communists.
Or being Jewish.
Seriously? Oh yeah, because Germans.
Yeah.
Russians were the exact same.
Russians were exactly the same. Yeah. The Stalin was killing off the communists himself. Didn't like them. So really, yeah, it was an absolute mess.
Do you guys think Stalin was trying to make communism look bad in front of all the other people?
Before the war, Stalin starved 10 million people to death in Ukraine.
That makes it Hitler bad.
His own hometown in Georgia, he had it cut off, and he had the population starved because he didn't like them.
What?
He was mad. He was a really, really horrible man. You know, if you think Hitler was bad, he was a fluffy bunny Care Bear compared to Stalin. I mean, seriously. I mean, Hitler was a prize shit. I do apologise for my language. I don't often swear, but he really was a shit. No, but when you come to Stalin, he's shitlord in chief. He's just. It's just no offence to the to anyone, but I'm sorry, Stalin was really, really horrible.
Did anyone actually like Stalin right now?
Most people didn't know what Stalin was like. They thought Stalin was their grandfather Stalin. They blamed, what a lot of Russians did, they actually blamed the local official. Like, Stalin's good. If Stalin knew what was happening here, he would be against it. And the local official would be the one who would get blamed.
Come on, everyone who knew Stalin dare go anywhere near him.
Except his wife. Stalin was terrified of his wife.
Stalin being his wife.
Yeah, he was absolutely... It was like Nero with his mother.
Yeah, Nero.
The great Emperor Nero used to hide behind his desk when his mother came in, and the guards would be stood there, and he's like, "Don't tell her I'm here!" And he'd hide. And he tried to kill her many times. And
disaster.
Yeah, that was a disaster. But Stalin was the same with his wife. He was terrified of his wife. And because she knew where all the bodies were kept, literally. But I should really do a video on Stalin. Stalin was a fascinating person. He really was a very clever man. He was a total sociopath. He planned everything ahead. When he started out in politics, he was brought up in the priesthood, and he decided to abolish the church. When he started out in politics, he knew he was going to end up in prison at some point. So he started sending boxes of chocolates and flowers.
Yeah, I know about that,
yeah, to the wives of the people who ran all the camps throughout Russia. So when he got arrested for being an agitator, he would be put on a train and sent to a camp. He'd get off the thing and say, "Hi, the guy who sent you the chocolates." And the guy in charge of the camp would say, "Oh, I'm so happy to see you. My wife thinks you're brilliant." And he would be put back on the train after dinner and go all the way back.
And the thing is, his dinner would be with the head of the...
Yeah, the camp commandant, yeah. On one of them, he literally stepped off the train, shook the hand of the commandant and got back on the train and took the return journey. That's how long he spent in prison, like 20 minutes, you know. Yeah.
About 5 minutes. Eat dinner. Bye. How did you feel lunch?
At the time, Lenin was... he was Lenin's head of security, and Lenin, he knew the government wanted to arrest Lenin, and they asked Stalin where Lenin was. And Stalin knew where he was, but he knew where Lenin was supposed to be, but he knew he wasn't there. He was supposed to be at this music hall. But he told them, he's at the music hall, but he knew that he wasn't, he knew he was at home. So he drove straight to his home while the secret police went to arrest Lenin. And Stalin went to his home and said, "I've got a car outside for you, the police are after you, get out of here." And Lenin got in the car and drove, and there was a train waiting for him, and it took him to Germany, where he was safe. And Stalin was... And Stalin, the police, the government thought, well, Stalin tried to get him, you know, he's one of our men. And Lenin was, hey, Stalin saved my life, he's one of mine. He was always planning ahead, and he was always positioning himself.
He didn't do it for Lenin. He did it so
no,
he could get power.
It was a complete... So he just used people. People to Stalin were just things to use.
Selfish.
Yeah. The biggest mass murderer in history, Genghis Yagoda, killed 10 million people. Biggest mass murderer in history. He killed 10 million people personally. Ordered their deaths. Right? The biggest ever killer ever. And he worked for Stalin. Stalin said, "Go kill all these people." Yagoda went and killed all of these people. And then then Stalin said, "Yagoda, how dare you murder all these people?" And he had him executed for committing murder.
But he just...
But that's what I mean by Grandpa Stalin. If he knew what was happening here, because Stalin found out Yagoda was killing people and had him executed. Stalin's good. But
Stalin ordered it.
Stalin ordered it. Yeah, this is the man.
But no one knows, and no one dares say, "Wait a minute, you did that," because he probably killed them.
Yeah. And these are the guys the Germans are fighting. These are the guys who fought in the Second World War. The guys who lived in that regime. So you might get a little bit more of an idea of the guys who you're using on the battlefield in games. These are men...
Terrified men.
Yeah, these are men who will march over minefields to set the minefields off.
Oh my God.
Right? Because they're ordered to. They will do whatever they are told.
And if they don't, they get shot in the back.
They'll be shot. And not just that. There's a thing called decimation that the Soviet army used, and what they would do is if the platoon had not followed orders, they would order all the men in the platoon to choose one man to kill, and they would beat him to death.
Yep.
Right?
Mm-hmm.
And what that does, that makes you no longer responsible. You're following orders. You're not going to take ownership of that. You're not going to say, I stabbed so-and-so to death. Right? You're going to say, I was ordered to do it. And that makes an army of automatons. That makes an army of people who will say, I was only following orders. So
and then they go home and they have that, what's that thing called? They have fear, and then they start feeling remorse of what sympathy for what they did, and they start feeling,
no, because you don't have to claim responsibility for what you did. You don't have to claim responsibility because you were just doing what you were ordered by the state, and the state's worse than you. There's nothing you as an individual Russian can possibly do that could be anything as bad as what the state was doing. The state was. I'm getting into politics now, but I'm afraid that's what we're dealing with. So really, if you see a Soviet soldier in the quilted jacket, he's actually in prison issue uniform. Although he may not actually have been in prison because they were just using the uniforms that they had handy. But that's what they are, and some of them probably were. What value are second echelon troops? Very little. Second echelon troops, untrained troops, are really there to absorb enemy bullets. They're there to take fire, they're there to slow the enemy down, because for every platoon of second echelon troops who are butchered by the advancing German army, they kill 1 or 2 Germans. They use German fuel up, they use German ammunition up, they use German food up, they sap the German will to fight, they make the German more tired. Russia was just buying time with bodies, just sending in people it didn't need to die. Didn't need to die, they didn't need to be sent in and killed like that, but they just kept sending waves of infantry in just to slow the Germans down. And it worked.
Yeah.
They won the war. There's a reason they won the war, there's a reason we ran away. There's a reason in 1940 we just saw the Germans coming, dropped everything, legged it for the beach and paddled over to good old Britain. There's a reason we did that. Because we didn't have the mentality that the Soviets had.
Because our generals weren't such imbeciles to shoot their men in the back if they didn't.
Well, that was the First World War, not the Second World War. But yeah,
no, it probably was the Second World War.
Occasionally, yeah.
We had commissars, that's the exact same thing, come on.
Yeah, we had red caps, they're not the same as commissars. You could find yourself locked up for refusing to join the army or refusing to follow orders.
Locked up, not killed.
Yeah. We were nowhere near where Russia was. They could hang you in a moment. And the Germans were very little better. They were slightly more...
They're both bad.
Yeah, they were slightly more ordered, should I say. But, German army generally was a professional army. And professional armies do not tend to run amok. The Soviet army was a conscript army. And conscript armies tend to behave rather badly. Mm-hmm. Not because they're bad people, but because they have no opportunity to be good. And I've done this in sociology and stuff, why soldiers do what they do. And that's, this is just it. So in Bolt Action, not wishing to drag the video on for 5 hours, in Bolt Action you do get the special rule which enables a unit to re-roll a morale, which is very useful, and it's good on the battlefield to play a game with, and it's also in a way reflecting reality, because the reality is these men are some of them are terrified, they daren't surrender, and some of them are simply
want to go.
Yeah. So that's it, and so that's why I thought I'd do the second echelon infantry at the same time as the normal infantry. Because we use the same figures for them, all we do is, for the second echelon, you just take out the machine guns and add rifles instead. So I've got spare figures for them. So if you want to make an entire army of raw recruits, you can do by simply swapping out the machine guns. There's no real difference between them. And actually, quite a few reserve infantry for the Russians were actually equipped the same as regular infantry. It's kind of a fallacy that the Russians had no rifles and stuff for their men.
They had rifle bullets.
Yeah, they had more than enough stuff. Russia had been stockpiling things for 20 years. They'd been mass producing weapons to keep people employed. So the Russians always had stockpiles of weapons. The Germans captured so many weapons they were able. If you look at photographs of German troops fighting in Africa, you'll find most of them using Russian equipment. They were using Russian PPSHs as a standard machine gun because the Germans were capturing so many submachine guns that they were able to equip the Africa Corps with all this captured Russian kit. The 76mm Russian field gun was the standard field gun of the Africa Corps, captured in Russia. The Germans captured so much stuff, and yet the Russians had so much more just stacked away in caves and houses and just stacked everywhere, loads of the stuff. It's an insanity, but it's just reality. Your second echelon troops could carry light machine guns, submachine guns and stuff, and would be reasonably well versed in how to use them. You could take anyone and in 20 minutes teach him how to fight. It doesn't take long. It's not like learning to drive a truck, you know? It's actually quite easy using weapons. So the idea that you would have people who don't know how to fire a gun fighting is silly because it doesn't take long to train them. And also, some people are actually defending their home. So you can put a huge amount of extra morale into somebody who is defending his hometown, which is kind of important. You know? Over to you. Questions?
No questions.
We've sort of done it all already.
Yeah.
Yeah. This is basically the Soviet army. I'm going to have to get another box, maybe two, but definitely one, of Soviet infantry, and I'm going to have to get a winter box because we're going to be doing winter war as well, aren't we?
You must have noticed that from the tanks.
Yeah, we've got some winter war tanks. At the moment, we aren't doing winter war, but I have painted the tanks up because I already had them, so I thought, why not? And it's not like we ever field all these tanks at the same time because that would make a bolt action game last 3 weeks with all the order dice.
No, I did do it once.
Yeah, but not with this many vehicles. I've got way more now than I had.
Way more last time. We had like 3 each. We got 6 each now.
Yeah. So that's it. That's the end. Oh, I should mention one last little thing. We do have a special rule called the Great Purge, which we use for certain early war games that we play. Shortly before the Second World War, there was Stalin executed all the officers.
Yeah.
Which is always something you shouldn't do when you're about to start the Second World War. You go around and shoot all your officers. Kind of silly, but it was the reason that the Soviet armies were defeated at the beginning of Barbarossa. It certainly helped the Germans defeating the Russians. Because on the table, the Russian army will win every day. The Russians can never lose a battle if you really think about it. If you use the numbers of stuff the Russians had, there's no way anyone could defeat them. Of course, so to mimic that, we're using a derivation of the green special rule, which is when you take your first morale, you, in the same way that you have the Great Patriotic War special rule, if you fail, you get an extra D6 pins. But that's only when we're using it for things like the war in Finland and stuff like that. So it's not a rule we generally use. It's just a rule we used that took place at the same time as the Purges. I'll actually go into more detail about that later on in another video if you want to know more about it. It's just an idea we came up with, but that's really by the by. And that's the end of the video.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. So over to you.
So if you enjoyed this video, please leave a like and subscribe. And comment down below if you want to know a little bit more about the history behind the Russians. And if we get enough comments and likes on the video, then we might do a history video on it. That's everything from me.
And that's everything from him. Good day.
Bye bye.